Hey everyone, my name is Wedge and welcome to the MTG Tournament Report. After last week's break to talk about some legacy results, we're back to standard here. We have the top 8s from Grand Prix Beijing and the Star City Invitational in Charlotte, North Carolina. Let's dive right into the Beijing top 8. With only 4 different decks, it could hardly be said to be a particularly diverse top 8. Yuya Watanabe took a Black Devotion deck to the top spot, one of 3 such decks in the top 8. Notably, Watanabe made an offbeat decision in running a playset of Staff of the Death Magus on his sideboard. This was a countermeasure against Boros Burn, which he predicted would start taking off soon, and that decision clearly paid off. 3 of the other top 8 decks were Boros Burn, including second place finisher Sherwin Poo. Boros Burn is a deck we don't get to see a lot of, so we'll be taking a closer look at it later on. Running down the rest of the Beijing list, 3rd place also went to Boros Burn. 4th went to the so-called Esper Midrange. In reality, the deck looks more aggressive than that, and we've seen aggro and Esper only on the fringes as standard. That's another one we'll be breaking down shortly. 5th was the 2nd Black Devotion deck. 6th and 7th were the last of the Boros Burn and Black Devotion decks respectively. And lastly, 8th place was Blue-White Devotion. We've seen the deck before, taking the established Blue Devotion list and adding in a Pharah and Detention Sphere. The Star City Games Open was a different story, with 7 different decks represented in its top 8. First place went to Travis Harrison running another Blue-White Devotion deck, a Pharah, Detention Sphere, and so on. Jacob Neighbors took 2nd with a Black-White Midrange deck. 3rd place went to a red aggro list reminiscent of the kind of decks that popped up when Theros was first released. John Monsters came in 4th. Instead of the typical Reaper of the Wilds, this list instead featured Sire of Insanity as a one-of. With the strength of Control and Standard and the ability of Monsters to just jam top decks later in the game, this makes a lot of sense, and another Sire comes in from the sideboard when needed. Moving on to 5th place, we see the only deck to take multiple places in the Invitational, Repeat Offender Black Devotion. 6th went to Esper Control, and 7th was the other Black Devotion deck. Unlike the Grand Prix winner, nobody here was using Staff of the Death Magus, but then again, there was no burn in the top 8, so the decision seems to have paid off. And lastly, 8th place went to Bant Control. Now, before you get too excited about it being a new deck, it's basically Blue-White Control. That said, the one addition that the 3rd color allows is fairly interesting. 3 Kiora the Crashing Wave make an appearance as alternate win conditions alongside Elspeth Sun's Champion. Kiora also gives the deck a way to stall against creatures in case removal is in short supply. Not incredibly likely, but a possibility. But with the amount of removal the deck already has and the emission of Elixir of Immortality, Kiora is there to release Krakens and stomp faces. To that end, Vorl of the Hulklade is also a one-of on sideboard to pick up some loyalty acceleration where possible. Now there are a couple decks we wanted to take a closer look at, so as promised, here they are. Neither of these decks are decks we haven't seen before, but they've both changed since we saw them last. So we're going to go into a bit more detail in looking at them. Let's start with Boros Burn. As you might have guessed from the deck's name, it focuses mainly on burn spells and is very light on creatures. In fact, Sherman Poo's 2nd place deck ran only Chandra's Phoenix, which is basically a repeatable burn spell. The other 2 decks accompanied the 4 Phoenixes with 4 Ash Zealot, another 2/2 with haste and a relevant combat ability. That's it for the main deck, but we saw some other creatures on sideboards, including Fire Drinker Satyr, Satyr Fire Dancer, and Spark Trooper. Moving on to spells, the core spell basis of the deck is mostly the same across all 3 versions. 4 Boros Charm are relevant almost exclusively for their burn mode. Each deck included 2 Chain to the Rocks, a great way to get rid of creatures too big to burn off. It's so effective, in fact, that each deck also ran an additional 2 on sideboard. Lightning Strike, Magma Jet, and Shock are pretty straightforward. Instant speed, damage, and the Scry Rider on Magma Jet, which is a pretty straightforward upside. We saw some minor variation in numbers of Searing Blood versus Shock, but each deck at least ran 3 of one and 4 of the other. Either way, there are going to be decks that Searing Blood has to come out against. Skullcrack is an instant lava spike with a very relevant upside in a standard full of Sphinx's Revelation and Grey Merchant of Asphodel. Warleader's Helix is the last spell to show up in all 3 decks, giving the deck a slightly longer lifespan against aggressive strategies. Lastly, we come to the card that took the place of Ash Zealot in the 2nd place deck, Toil and Trouble. Trouble is a highly effective counter to Revelation-dependent control decks, especially in combination with Skullcrack. Toil makes for the deck's only way to gain card advantage. It can also finish off a player on an empty hand or put a player within a range of a Trouble burnout. Land bases were pretty self-explanatory, combining red-white shocklands, temples, and guild gates with mutavaults and mountains. The aforementioned Toil and Trouble also brought with it a Blood Crypt and Temple of Silence to provide black mana to cast the Toil side. So that's Boros Burn. Let's talk Esper Midrange. With 24 creatures, it really does look more like some kind of aggressive Esper Humans deck, though with few actual humans. Soldier of the Pantheon, Precinct Captain, and Bremas, all 4 ofs allow the deck to get off to a fast start. The other 4 of leaves Sky Knight, locks down pieces of other aggressive strategies, as well as Planeswalkers and control decks. Obsidian Ghost Council of 3 of is a big body that also drains for 2 every turn. On top of all that, its repeated blinking to exile and back plays nice with the 2 of Afara, God of the Polis. Of course, we would be remiss not to mention the other big Afara synergy with Bremas. As long as Bremas keeps attacking and blocking, and it has vigilance to do both, Afara gets to trigger every turn. The last 3 slots in the creature base are narrower 1-ofs. Keening Apparition is a bear with upside, and its upside is relevant against decks running enchantments, gods, or both. We're looking at you, Blue-White Devotion. Imposing Sovereign slows down other aggressive decks while also reducing the number of viable blockers on the other side of the table. And Pack Rat's a card you only really need 1 of, especially with Afara on the board to fuel its own ability. The 11 spells in the deck are mostly removal. Detention Sphere as a 4 of remains some of the most solid removal available. Far and Away and Ultimate Price are both 2 ofs. Ultimate Price is good for taking out creatures too big to go to combat with favorably, while Far and Away can swing combat in the deck's favor a bit more dramatically. 2 Spear of Heliod make a lot of sense with this many creatures in the deck, and also provide repeatable removal against opponents that try to race with creatures. Lastly, a 1 of Whip of Erebos also hoses aggressive decks and burn decks alike. It also plays nice with Lee of Sky Knight's Enter the Battlefield trigger and Keening Apparition's Sacrifice ability, not to mention the cute interaction with Obsidian. The land base is 12 Shocklands and 8 Temples, skipping Deceit for 4 each of Enlightenment and Silence. A few basic planes and a pair of Mutavaults make up the rest of the base. And that's it for this week. Next week we have a Grand Prix in Phoenix and a Star City Open in Milwaukee. We'll be here with the top 8s from those. As always, subscribe below for the latest and most reliable Magic the Gathering information you could ever need. This is the Mana Source. I'm Wedge. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.